Well, we are close to the end of our year, and we've been using this book, Living the Science of Mind, the whole year to guide us through our topics because we're celebrating 100 years of our teaching, the science of mind. Our theme for the month is happiness and fulfillment, and today we're looking at the role that the silence plays in our happiness and fulfillment. And how about that beautiful Silent Night by Miles Johnston? Wasn't that so? Yeah. And I was thinking about the words of that carol, Silent Night, Holy Night, and how each word is a symbol of something that relates to our topic this morning. Silent is not the absence of noise and disturbance and sounds. Silent means something else. It means peaceful, watchful, present, not moving. And holy means complete, nothing missing, respectful. And night is the inward, resting, restorative frame of mind before a new beginning. And in the carol, it gives us some clue about this silent, holy night. It says, all is calm and bright. So it's talking about an inner illumination that guides us silently. It's talking about the communion of the Spirit with the great all there is. Now, this silence is celebrated in many faith traditions, and I was remembering how in 2015 we were studying Native American wisdom through the writings of Kent Nerburn and the Native American teacher Michael Garrett, and we learned at that time that the original people of this continent were quite diverse, and they had and still do have a whole range of different customs and languages, and they had different ways of believing, and yet there was among them a shared reverence for the silence, as there was for the earth and its holiness, and nature and its cycles, and for being in harmony with all of that. And being in disharmony with all of that, Michael Garrett wrote, is to be out of step with the universe, and that's when our energies become poorly focused and we feel disturbed and disconnected. We also learned that in many Native American cultures and languages, there is no special word for religion, because spirituality and its practices are completely and fully integrated into everything. Art, healing, speaking, raising children, everything. It's all seamlessly integrated as a way of staying in harmony. And if we lose our conscious connection to this harmony with the greater circle, we can get back to it by being still and watching from within, from that place of bright, still illumination. So this holy season for me is a really good time to ask myself, what do I need to do to stay in harmony and balance? Now, this silence is common to so many Native American people. It shows up in its form of quiet mindfulness, especially in the way of talking together. So for many Native American people, talking together is a form of communion. It's more than a conversation. It's a way of honoring, witnessing, listening. And Kent Nerburn, when he's writing about the Lakota nation, says, silence was meaningful with the Lakota nation, and granting a space of silence before talking was done in the practice of true politeness and regard for the rule that thought comes before speech. And in the midst of sorrow, sickness, death, or misfortune of any kind, and in the presence of the notable or great, silence was the mark of respect. More powerful than words was silence with the Lakota nation. the talking circles or the councils of the Native American traditions are characterized by this respect and this equality, and so that talking and being together became a spiritual experience. I was reading up about this online, and I discovered this beautiful paper written in 1987, and I'll put it up here so you can get it yourself, by Mary Haight, and originally printed in 1987, in which she interviews many of the indigenous people's cultural ways of communicating together. And her research is headed with this quote. It says, "Silence is the cornerstone of character. The fruits of silence are self-control, endurance, patience, dignity, and reverence." Oh, it's a beautiful paper. And in part 2 of it, she shares what she's gathered from the various different cultures about the appropriateness of silence. When is it appropriate to be silent? She says, for example, at religious ceremonies, or when an elder is speaking. And it's also appropriate to be silent in an unfamiliar situation, or when you are with strangers that you don't know yet, and it's based on an unwillingness to disturb the harmony of a group of people who are unfamiliar to you, by thrusting your presence upon them. It would be inconsiderate to do that. It's also appropriate to pause frequently and at length in conversation, and sometimes listeners will indicate with a nod or a murmur that they are still listening when the speaker pauses because they know the speaker's not finished yet. Pauses in conversation are used for emphasis and spaciousness, and these pauses do not mean that the person has finished speaking at all. And it's also appropriate to be silent when someone is angry, out of control, or overcome with something, say, like grief. It's also appropriate to be silent when visiting someone and not to say too much and to just be there to enjoy their company. Oh, that's beautiful. There's so much more in that paper. And as I was reading through it, I remembered how in my late 20s I realized that I didn't really know that much about my grandmother and my grandfather on my mother's side, because I was young when I was around them, and I was in that phase where I did all the talking when I visited. I was in that phase where everything was about me. And my happiness, and I told them about that all the time. And so in my 20s, I felt this deep sense of wanting to know more about them. And my grandfather had already passed on, but my grandmother was still alive. So I made a point of visiting with her and sitting with her and listening to her. I asked her, "Tell me about your husband. Tell me about your mother. Tell me about your father." And I listened, and it wasn't all easy to hear. Parts of it brought me to tears. Parts of her story shattered my sense of innocence about my family of origin. Parts of it made me furious and frustrated that I couldn't do a single thing to change it. You see, her mother, my grandmother's mother, was emotionally unstable. And it was made worse by alcoholism. And so her mother would show up drunk at junior high school, wearing a cabbage leaf on her head for some reason. And she would embarrass my grandmother and call her out of school and berate her in front of everybody and take her home to do chores, And I could hear, as my grandmother told me the story, I could hear the pain and conflict of a daughter loving her mother even in her brokenness. And I got to hear from my grandmother how the alcoholism was reproducing itself in her youngest son and in her husband. And she disclosed that there had been violence in the family that I didn't know about. at a time in the world where women had even fewer protections than they do now. So listening to her silently was an education for me, education in courage and dignity. And I think for her, I think it was a healing for her too, to be listened to so thoroughly, so silently, so wholly. And after listening to her, that's when I realized that was maybe the first time that I knew her in a way I hadn't before, because I didn't know how to be quiet long enough to listen that deeply. You see, in my youth, I had mistaken her quietness for weakness, for ineffectiveness. And now, listening to her, I could hear and feel and know her strength. When I think of this encounter with my grandmother, it reminds me to listen to people today, to take interest in people, to ask them about their lives, about what is important to them, and not to be in too much of a hurry to display myself and thrust myself upon their experience. Not too hurry to fill any pause in their sentences with my knowledge, especially because I may not have another opportunity to be together with them again. I mean, what if this were our last time together? Would we not be more mindful, more kind, more spacious? I remember a long time ago, one Sunday I arrived at the center for work, 7 o'clock in the morning, but my heart was broken because my father had died the night before. And I just got myself to the parking lot in my spot, and I sat there at the steering wheel, and I knew I couldn't stop it. The grief just came up, and the tears just poured out, and I was sitting there, what am I going to do? And a member of our community saw what was happening and came to the parking spot and opened the passenger door and got in and just took my hand and just sat there silently. Oh, what a healing. My silence was being witnessed silently. I mean, she didn't ask for an explanation. She didn't try to pep me up. She said, you got to get it together, buddy. She just sat there and created this space for a tremendous healing to take place. And there was that moment that made it possible for me to get it together. I've never forgotten that. It reminds me of a poem by Rumi, the words of which go, listen, clam up your mouth, and be silent like an oyster shell, for that tongue of yours is the enemy of the soul, my friend. When the lips are silent, the heart has hundreds of tongues. With this holy season of silent nights, I'm considering the silence. Something to restore me. Kevin was reminding me that this whole world is geared up to keep us busy, active, almost as if it's designed to stop us from realizing that we're creatures with needs. Like a houseplant that needs sun and water. We as spiritual beings, not only do we need sun and water, but we need silence. And because of the way of things, that silence has to be a conscious choice. How am I going to access the silence? This season, I've got to make a choice. I've learned a lot about silence from the Quakers. Quakers, as I understand, believe that every person is guided by the divine, and everyone is known by God and can know God in a direct and personal way. And they are guided by that relationship. And so they have many words for the divine: God, the light within, Christ, seed, inward teacher, whole bunches of them. And they strive to live their lives guided by that direct contact with the divine. And that direct contact comes to them in the silence. So what happens in a Quaker worship setting? Quaker worship is based on silent waiting, where we expect to come into the presence of God. In this living silence, we listen for the small, still voice that comes from God through the inward light. Worshipping together in silence is a way for a community to be brought together in love and faithfulness. Now, our assigned reading from Living the Science of Mind by Dr. Ernest Holmes, our founder, is all about the silence, and I wanted to share with you some of the parts. All life, he writes, is in motion, or at least all manifest life is in a state of vibration. But at the very center of this vibration, there appears to be something which is motionless, still. Something which itself does not move, and yet from which all motion must come. It's the silence. Now, going into the silence does not mean that our mental or physical activity is obliterated, otherwise we would disappear, and we are not trying to discover how to be less of ourselves, we are trying to discover how to bring more of ourselves into expression. And Jesus, he writes, gave a very good example of going into the silence when he told us that in prayer we should enter the closet and close the door. It is evident that he was not referring to a real closet. He could not have been referring to any particular physical space, like a walled-in room or anything like that. No, his language was symbolic. Entering the closet means withdrawing into one's own mind, for it is from one's own mind that the creativeness which we possess can come forth. This closet has been referred to as the secret place of the Most High. And to enter into one's closet is to put aside the external confusion, the clash of personalities and wills, to judge not from outward appearances, but from inward tranquility. Next, we are told, having entered the secret place of the Most High, and having closed the door, and having temporarily shut out external appearances, which means all created facts, every circumstance whatsoever, all erroneous causes and effects, and every idea which denies the unity of the Spirit, having entered the secret place and closed the door, then we have entered into the silence. And the next step, we are told, is to make known our requests in secret. So let us do that then. I invite you to breathe in. And as you exhale, letting your eyes close, to shut down sensory perception, at least visually, and to do as our founder instructs, to let go of everything for a moment. In other words, to let everything be, to not try to do anything. Not trying to stop our minds or our bodies. We're accessing the stillness that is always and persistently present at the center of our being. And then in this quietness, we let our request form. It might be a wish for your life, a vision for your family, or an idea for the world. You might feel it rather than see it, or you might see it, or you might be telling it to yourself in words. It doesn't really matter. And then we have been instructed then to move into gratitude, to rejoice in this time of contemplation together, in the unity of spirit, in each other, and to rejoice in the pervasive presence of the living Spirit. And then we bring it to close by saying together, and so it is. I invite you to breathe in deeply with me and to sigh.